Okay, well, it's been a lot of work putting this together, and we have been incredibly fortunate to have had speakers who are willing to come a long distance. And Montreal was far, but Washington, D.C. is further. I'd like to introduce you to Mr. James Jatras, who is a specialist in international relations. He, I guess, is still a lawyer by profession, but yeah, okay. Yeah, well, nobody likes to admit that anymore. Sooner or later, going to be a special tax on lawyers, right? Seeking out lawyers, you know. In any case, in communicating with him over the last few weeks, I mean, I've gotten emails from Bosnia, and he was in Kiev as recently as Thursday, and I asked him if he ever sleeps, and he gave me the impression that no, not if there's anything important to do. In any case, he actually, I emphasize again, is from Washington, D.C., and created the site repealed.com, and I think that the opening line says it all. Repeal is a website to getting rid of the worst law most Americans have never heard of. Join me in welcoming Mr. James Jatras.
Most schoolyard bullies don't get a reception like that, but I appreciate it. I want to. Yes, it's no joke, pal. Unfortunately, it's real. I want to thank the Honorable Sinclair Stevens and the Most Reverend Dorian Baxter and the Progressive Canadian Party for asking me here. Also, Petros Dunn and John Richardson and all the Brockers out there. I'd like to start with agreeing with one point that was made about the big threshold this represents, that this is a historic time, that we'll look back on this as something quite momentous in the history of not only relations between the United States and Canada, but in world history. But I'd like to put it another way. I don't think we're going to look at this as the day the empire came and swept everything into its maw. I think quite the opposite, really. We've got to stop saying will when we talk about FATCA. It will do this, it will do that. Let's say it would do this, it would do that if it happens. But I think there's very good reason to think it will not happen if some fairly minimal things are done. One of the big advantages the FATCA proponents have is a kind of a psychological warfare, really. Resistance is futile. You will be assimilated. We're so big. We're so bad. We're going to do mean things to you if you don't comply. And it appears on some level to be working, that the little countries come crawling on their hands and knees and beg to sign an intergovernmental agreement, an IGA, with us. And that's what needs to happen from the point of view of the FATCA proponents. Let's be clear about something. FATCA is not like the World Trade Organization. It's not like NAFTA. It's not like the Convention on the Law of the Sea. It's not like any bilateral or multilateral international agreement where the various parties sit across the table as at least formal equals, even if they're not equal in terms of their bargaining power, if one side gets a better deal out of it than the other. It's not like that at all. It is a unilateral decision on the part of the United States, and even that needs a qualification, by the way, because you would be shocked to know how few people in America have even heard of FATCA. You know, there's a sense the rest of the world has that, well, the Americans have decided, what can we do? Well, what Americans? Probably fewer than 100 Americans are really that involved in the process at all. I don't think 1 in 1,000 Americans has heard of FATCA. Even earlier this summer, I was talking to the chief of staff of one of the senators on the Finance Committee, the Committee of Jurisdiction of FATCA, and he said, well, Jim, what are you working on these days? Well, I'm trying to kill this FATCA thing. What's that? He never heard of it. And this is not an ignoramus. This is one of the most intelligent, plugged-in people there. The thing, as you know, I'm not going to go into all the details. You've heard the details, was slipped into the dead of night in this jobs bill, and nobody has really ever heard of the thing. But anyway, we in the United States, and our infinite wisdom, have decided we are going to do this. And it's a unilateral decision on our part. It's extraterritorial, and we're going to impose it on you. We have decided you will obey. and if you don't obey, you will be punished. It's fairly simple. And you see this in the words of, let me quote from a Canadian news report from the 28th of November. Canadian Finance Minister Jim Flaherty has said Ottawa is, quote, nearing a conclusion on the issue of an IGA with the United States, suggesting a similar arrangement as reached by the UK is in the offing. Quote, an agreement with the U.S. to share information on a government-to-government basis within prescribed limits will bring certainty to the application of the FATCA regime to Canadians and will also facilitate compliance by our financial institutions, he said in a statement. Canadian Bank Association President Terry Campbell said, Canadian financial institutions have no choice but to comply with the U.S. law because the penalties can be onerous, a 30% tax on U.S. source income. But short of having the U.S. authority change their law, and short of having the world financial system being radically restructured, neither of which is going to happen, authorities around the world have come to the conclusion they must deal with the United States to make this as administratively feasible as possible. In other words, they see the world exactly as the way I just described it. The Americans have made a demand. We must agree to the demand, because if we don't, they will punish us. But if we agree with it, the punishment will be somewhat lighter. And it's a demand on, again, I am rather fond of the word sovereignty. It's a demand against Canadian sovereignty. It's a demand against Canadian institutions. It's a demand against Canadian citizens. And I'm not going to get into all the details of how this would work if it happens, how you sort out the dual citizens and the spouses of, that's an enforcement and application regime which, God forbid, ever should come to pass. But my job is to figure out how to keep it from happening. Again, it's based on a threat that's based on what is essentially sanctions for noncompliance. The United States is threatening sanctions against Canada, one of our closest allies, trade partners, blah, blah, blah. But we are threatening a hostile act against this friendly country if they do not comply with the enforcement of an extraterritorial unilateral law. And that's where we get, as Mr. Campbell said, we have no choice but to comply. To avoid direct extraterritorial enforcement by the U.S. on Canadian institutions, Canada instead can enforce this U.S. law on itself. We'll just put a Canadian glove on the American hand, or fist, as the case may be. There's no nice way to call the IGA anything but a capitulation. So what this means in practice is, if an IGA is signed, that Canada would then enact domestic legislation, a kind of a FATCA-oid law, where under not American law, but Canadian law would require Canadian institutions to supply basically all the information demanded by the IRS so they can just then scoot it over to their buddies in Washington. I would disagree with one point of Professor Christians, because he said under FATCA itself, Canadian institutions, which are FFIs, have the decision to whether or not they will be PFFIs, whether they will participate in FATCA. In fact, they don't have that decision, because under Canadian law, it would be illegal for them to do this. And unless an IGA is signed, and unless domestic legislation is enacted to enforce it, a Canadian institution has a dilemma. Do I observe U.S. law or Canadian law? Well, there's only one law they can follow unless there's an IGA, and that's Canadian law. It would be a violation of Canadian law. So as things stand, they cannot comply. There is no decision to be made unless your government capitulates, as it has shown every indication it wishes to do. So what this means is that the government is essentially engaged in a collusion with financial institutions against the rights of Canadian citizens under Canadian law. If, for example, we're talking about the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act that would be violated if the institution were to supply this information. What the United States is essentially saying to Canada is, look, we're reasonable people. We understand that you cannot comply with FATCA because it would violate your law. So we will generously allow you to change your law. In fact, we will generously allow you to change your law not to permit compliance with our unilateral demand, but to require compliance with our unilateral demand. We're reasonable people. And this is done under the guise of partnership, as has been mentioned before. It's a completely one-way street. This is a partnership in the same sense that a smaller guy in prison ends up as somebody's partner. That this is something that there's no benefit for the Canadian side because, again, the difference between residence and citizen-based taxation. On the face of it, you look at Article 2 of the IGA, the difference between what the foreign partner, in quotes, has to provide under subsection A and what the United States has to provide under subsection B are vastly different. And in addition to that, in Article 6, the United States makes a moral commitment that we will eventually bring those two things into line, but we know that no legislation like that will ever be passed. Again, what we're talking about is simply the promise of some pain relief for Canadian institutions by basically transferring that pain to Canadian citizens, infringing against Canadian sovereignty, and so forth. In effect, it's a preemptive surrender. It calls to mind, there's a famous quotation by Otto von Bismarck that preemptive war is kind of like committing suicide out of fear of death. That what they are doing is by agreeing to the IGA with the U.S., they are bringing about the very harm they seek to avoid. Because the fact of the matter is, and this is probably the dirtiest little secret in the whole thing, these IGAs, which, by the way, are not in the FATCA law itself. There's nothing in the FATCA law itself. What happened was, as the law got passed, as I said, in the sort of the dead of night there, the Treasury Department gets it and said, oh my God, what are we going to do with this? We cannot possibly enforce this thing against every financial institution in the world and kick off a financial and possibly trade war in the process. What are we going to do? They were supposed to have published the draft regulations by the end of 2011. They didn't. They held on to them until February 8th when, by a sheer coincidence, on the very same day, they released the joint statement with the 5 EU countries saying, oh, we're going to do this here partnership thing where they will enforce it on their own institutions and they don't have to go report directly to the IRS at all because they know that is the only thing that will make this work. We simply do not have the, we're big, we're bad, we're, everybody's scared of us. We simply do not have the resources to actually enforce this against every institution in the world. The only way we can make this work is if we bamboozle enough foreign governments to go along with it themselves, and they know full well that they don't benefit from the deal, but they can kid themselves that they are at least being relieved of some of the cost and regulatory burden, and worst of all, they're being pushed by their own institutions to sign these IGAs. The bottom line is no IGAs, no FATCA. And this is why Canada becomes so crucial here, because if Canada turns around and says, no, we're not going to sign an IGA with the U.S., we're not going to allow FATCA to be enforced here in the U.S., and there are remedies we have if you try to enforce it on our institutions, and we can talk about some of those, this throws a monkey wrench into their plans, because it's one thing if some little tiny country or one that's marginal to the U.S. Financial and economic global picture were to try to not comply with FATCA. China itself is not going to go along with FATCA. That is itself a major problem. I don't think Brazil will go along with it. What the Russians might do is another question. We very well could be looking at kind of a BRICS versus Europe kind of thing, where there's already going to be a split. But that's why Canada comes down to being so crucial. If Canada were to say no, a lot of other countries in the world would look at it and say, well, if the Yanks can't even get them on board, that means this is not going to fly. So that's why it is so crucial what happens up here. Let me shift gears a bit and talk about the situation back in the United States. I've never seen a law that is so badly written, so vulnerable, so big, fat, dumb, and happy, just waiting for somebody to punch a hole in it. Let me back up. There are some classic catastrophes in American politics. The catastrophic, good name for it, the Catastrophic Coverage Act of 1989 was repealed 17 months after it was enacted, when it turned out that the costs of implementing it were far in excess of the benefits that people were getting. Now, in fact, under that law, there were people who got benefits under that law. Under FATCA, nobody gets nothing. The only benefit, if you want to call it that, to the United States is, according to the Joint Economic Committee scoring, an additional $800 million something, $800 million per year in the Treasury that they think they will recover if they're lucky. That's enough to keep our government running for 2 hours, as opposed to estimates that worldwide costs for implementing FATCA could run to $1 trillion. Now, where does that $1 trillion go? Does it go to the U.S. Treasury? No, it doesn't. It goes into the pockets of tax lawyers, accountants, software providers, and so forth, which unfortunately is where most of these firms, when FATCA was enacted, who'd they run to? They ran to their lawyers, regulatory lawyers, consulting firms, and so forth, who said to them, well, one thing we can say for sure, FATCA is not going away. We have to start to comply now. And meanwhile, they've got dancing dollar signs in their eyes, knowing that they're going to send their kids to school and retire on this damn law. So basically, there's a systematic error built into the perceptions of this. One of the other great debacles in American legislative history was the Dubai ports thing, which I actually had a hand in. In defeating, but that's another story. I'll tell you sometime. I talked to one lobbyist in Washington with one of the financial associations who said that he does not expect the fact, by the way, they're not doing anything to fight FATCA, they're spending millions of dollars to start to comply with FATCA, but he told me that he does not expect FATCA to be around 3 years from now. He just figures it will go the trajectory of the Catastrophic Coverage Act. Once it turns into a multi-billion-dollar disaster all around the world, then somebody will say, gee, we better try to do something to fix this. Now, wouldn't it make a lot of sense that instead of waiting till the train wreck occurs, we anticipate the train wreck and see what could be done to head it off? I probably shouldn't say this, especially since we're being videotaped, so I won't name the organization, but let's say there's a Canadian financial association here that the head of it has spoken very strongly against FATCA, as has Minister Flaherty. And they would take umbrage at saying, oh, well, you haven't tried to fight FATCA. Well, what have you done? Well, we've sent letters to the Treasury Department. We are so grateful to the opportunity of the Treasury Department to submit these comments on the proposed regulations, and let us assure you that we share fully the goals of this legislation, blah, 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 and then they give minute details, all the little tweaks and touches they think could be put into the regs, which A, won't be adopted, and B, won't fix the problem, rather than saying, instead of spending millions on millions of dollars to comply with FATCA, why don't we spend 1% of that to try to get rid of FATCA? I am convinced, based on other legislative experience, if the facts of FATCA were better known, especially, obviously in Congress, but in many points of influence in Washington generally, I'm guessing if you had somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000 a month to work with for about a year, you could get FATCA repealed, which is a tiny fraction. I mean, there's a methodology to this. You don't go walk up to Congress. The Australians did this. Say, you think you might repeal FATCA, do you? No, don't think so. Right, well, I guess that's it then. That's not how you get laws repealed. You have to mount a campaign. You put ads in places like Roll Call saying, what's the worst law most Americans have ever heard of? You list it up. Could go to www.worstlawEver.com, and I've already reserved that URL for that purpose. It's, Congress is like any other big, dumb, bureaucratic machine. You have to mount a serious effort to educate, to inform, Timothy Geithner is leaving the Treasury Department. His successor will be named at some point. You get to skin him alive during his confirmation hearings. I mean, there's all sorts of things you can do to extort embarrassing answers out to publicize how bad this law is, what it will cost Americans in terms of withdrawn investment from the United States. I mean, again, I won't go into all the details. You can find it all on, repealfatca.com anyway. There's a way to do this, but it's not being done. The thing survives only because there is no organized effort to do it, which brings us back to the IGAs. Treasury isn't a race against time. They know that in order to continue the psychological impression that resistance is futile, they have to keep getting more of these signed as quickly as possible. And frankly, I don't think it's going as fast for them as they wanted to go. We're getting close to the end of the year here. They were supposed to have 5 EU agreements signed up. 5, I'm not counting Ireland, for goodness sake. The 5 big boys signed up by the end of the year. Will they get 1? Will they get 2 more by the end of the year? I don't know. They're not going to get all 5. And meanwhile, what they want to do is get that sewed up before any kind of serious repeal measure can get any ground in the United States. That's why Canada is so crucial. If Canada rushes this process through and signs an IGA with the United States, it will be very damaging. Frankly, it will be small comfort if we say, yeah, but they might be able to defeat it in Parliament later. Frankly, I don't know how great the odds of that are. Where are the New Democrats? Where are the liberals? Where's the PQ? Where are our more libertarian-minded members of the Conservative Party? Where is the damn media in this country? Why is the media acting like bulletin boards for government statements, which is just as bad as what we do in the United States? It's part of the problem here is that we're all individuals who are basically talking to each other, but we're getting frozen out by the system of what constitutes a real issue. And I don't know that anybody has a good answer for this, because I know that not only my own messages, but many of the people in this room sent things to people in the media and say, look, Canada's sovereignty, billions and billions of dollars of Canadian wealth are at stake here, and you guys are not covering this story. What's going on? Now, I don't have a good answer to that, but there was some discussion earlier on of things Canada could do. Things having to do with NAFTA and so forth. I think also there are WTO remedies. There are many other things. I mean, on the face of it, for example, this is a trade violation. This is a discriminatory trade practice because, remember, FATCA only applies to FFIs. You're saying in so many words, only non-U.S. institutions have to bear this discriminatory burden, and U.S. institutions do not. That's trade action right there. What would be important is not what the many things there are that could be done, but rather your government needs to decide it's not going to accept this, because in my mind, that would be sufficient. If the Canadian government said, A, no IGA, B, we will not allow FATCA to be enforced in the United States because it's American law, not a Canadian law. We will not allow American FFIs to comply with FATCA because it would violate Canadian laws. And thirdly and fourthly, if you do it, if you try to enforce this Canadian law against our institutions, hit them with 30% withholding and so forth, we will hit you with a whole raft of remedies, including domestic lawsuits in the United States from aggrieved Canadian institutions as well as from the Canadian government, trade actions, and anything else we can think of to retaliate. I can guarantee they will not pull that trigger. But what it takes is, you've heard of the famous saying that a liberal is somebody who won't take his own side in a fight. And unfortunately, you have a government in Canada that seems to talk a good game. And, Minister Flaherty said some very good things about this, so has Mr. Campbell. And then they turn around and point toward a capitulation. And I don't say this to insult them, but to appeal to them and say, look, why don't you pay attention to your own words and do what you said instead of saying one thing and then doing another? By the way, there seems to be some kind of an odd pro-American bias, especially among conservative parties or at least parties that carry a conservative label that, oh, well, the Americans are good friends, et cetera, and, we really owe them a lot. I don't know what it is exactly, but we owe them a lot. And so we should go along with this. Even when the thing you're going along with, it's not conservative, it's not progressive, it's just dumb. Is that the way a friend behaves? I mean, if I'm drunk and I say, hey, let's get in the car and go somewhere, does a friend jump in the car for a joyride, or does he take my keys away? A real friend says no under some circumstances. So I'm asking, as a Yank, oh, I guess I'm not exactly a Yank. I live in Virginia, but it's in any case, I was born a Yank. I'm asking, as a friend, that Canada should say no to the United States and just protect its own self-interest with the legal means necessary to it. The other side to this is, as much as the efforts of individuals to try to fight this are important, what is really needed is institutional support. Somebody, and it's not going to be banks, by the way, but somebody, whether we're talking about, stock and equity funds, things, there are people who are already spending millions and millions of dollars to comply with this thing. And if a tiny fraction of that were put forward to publicizing the views that we're hearing here today in Canada against the IGA, if we have time to do that, in the United States, I'm convinced it could pay huge dividends. So one thing I would ask you to do is put your thinking caps on. Whom do you know? Maybe you know some rich individuals. Maybe you know some people in the financial community who can say, yeah, you're right. This is a dumb thing to do. It's going to cost me a lot more money to comply with this than to fight the thing. Let's get this thing started. So anyway, that's I think that's pretty much all I've got, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very, very much. I've taken a few notes, but I hope we can remain in communication. I had what I thought was an inspiration as a result of your talk. That inspiration is Canada should tell the U.S., the Canadian government should tell the U.S., we are putting legislation into Parliament which will take effect after, or unless you repeal, after FATCA, which will withhold 30% of all income by Americans in Canada. In other words, if you can do it, we can do it. And the out for both sides is to repeal FATCA.
I think that would be a great idea. Obviously, there's a prerequisite for that, and that is you don't do this. I mean, obviously, that would require the government to say no to FATCA initially, and then if you, the Americans, continue with this, then we will take the following countermeasure. Absolutely, yes, I agree. Thanks.
I was wondering if you can bring us up to date. What countries have signed IGAs with the United States with respect to this? Has the United Kingdom signed something?
They were the first one, and then I believe Denmark was the second one. That's right, I was mistaken. It wasn't Ireland, Denmark. Yeah. Oh, Ireland too, okay. And Mexico has too. I've seen a report that Mexico has signed. Right. Has Parliament actually?
No, that's right. It needs to go.
Because you see inconsistent things reported too, as they say they've initialed an agreement. Well, they initialed it or signed it, and Switzerland has the Model 2 non-reciprocal version, which frankly I don't understand. Why does a country do that at all? I mean, drop the pretense that it's a partnership? This just basically says, okay, we will comply.
What the Swiss agreement says is that we'll ask our banks to seek waivers. That's literally what it says. We'll ask all of our. They're saying we're not going to collect from the PFFIs and then give it to you. We're going to say it's okay for the PFFIs to give it to you. So we're going to just allow, in contravention of bank secrecy, the old bank secrecy, right?
Which means they would basically suspend application of bank secrecy.
Yes. So they're just telling they're just telling their own companies, you go ahead and seek waivers. But what they've sort of done here is, I think they've given themselves a bit of an escape hatch in that, okay, Swiss PFFIs are going to seek waivers, and if not, they don't have to close accounts that they do have to withhold. They don't have to close accounts, but they do have to withhold. And so they've, I don't know, it's a little bit.
Yeah, I do sometimes wonder if some of these countries are pursuing a kind of a rope-a-dope strategy.
Yeah, I don't know what the Swiss agreement, I don't know what anyone is. It's, frankly, I think that is an abomination, and the U.S. would be embarrassed if people understood what was going on there, because, I mean, if it's supposed to be catching fat cat tax cheats, and the first thing you do is make a favorable, but anyway, so to answer that question, the UK one is the farthest along. From the U.S. perspective, these are all, they don't need any Senate, as far as I can tell, any Senate review at all. They are being considered, I think, competent authority agreements.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
In fact, at the one conference was at, there was a guy from Treasury there. He said they're executive agreements from the U.S.
Yeah,
point
they're
of view.
not even that. I don't think they're even that. I think that's aspirational.
That's what he said they were. But
yeah, well, he doesn't know.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you why. Because the constitutional scholars that have studied treaties and executive agreements would not recognize the IGA. So the Treasury does not know what an EA is, an executive agreement is. It is a competent authority. What the IGA is, if they don't even take that to Senate, they don't even take that to the House, that's just a competent authority agreement. That's all. Which the competent authorities, this is how they're packaging it. But I'll tell you, there's a lot of murky stuff around that we could look at. But anyway, to answer the question, so the UK is furthest along. We also have them with Denmark, Mexico, Switzerland, and Ireland. Okay. No.
that was reported, though, as well, but then I saw nothing on it after that.
But they did sign, they were one of the 5.
Well, that was the thing in principle with France and Germany and so forth.
Right, the embarrassment is where's the agreement with France? They were supposed to be next.
And I think you point out a good thing, too, is that if we ever were able to get some traction on a real representation on fact, all of these legal and constitutional infirmities would be very fertile ground.
I can't believe you can't get that guy that asked if NAFTA was unconstitutional. Who was that? He's a very respected academic in the U.S. and John Yu. Yeah, he's known for other reasons, for being notorious, right? Because he's the apologist for
torture guy.
Yeah, exactly. But he and a bunch of people asked whether NAFTA and these executive agreements were themselves unconstitutional, and there's no reason why this IGA especially would offend even the biggest offenders of the executive agreement, because this isn't even that. It's not even pretending to be a treaty of any kind.
No, at least their public position is an executive agreement. What it is on the other side, by the way, is an interesting question, because on the other side, some of them might have to consider it a treaty.
Well, I think Canada would have to go through parliamentary procedure.
How can something be a treaty on one side, not a treaty on the other?
Well, that's American exceptionalism is the answer to that, and it always has been. And if you go look at those articles on what is an executive agreement, I mean, you have to understand that it's actually an interesting problem for lawmakers. Somebody like, maybe you've got a list of some very conservative people here, but you could even get Carl Levin on board on a constitutional challenge, because it's the president who wrote FATCA, Congress. But the president is going to go sign agreements under which he is not going to have the executive branch enforce a law written by Congress totally on his own. The president is doing that without any congressional approval whatsoever through an IGA. In other words,
except what they're doing, as I understand it, is using the sort of the very broad deemed compliant.
Yes, I know, but I mean,
provision
just as
of the law to say, well, the secretary has very broad authority to deem compliant anything he wants.
Yes.
If it accomplishes the purpose of the act.
Yeah, but I mean, if you got those guys seeing what they were doing here as a constitutional matter, this is not a treaty. It is not even pretending. I mean, I love it that the Treasury is calling it an executive agreement, because it is not. An executive agreement, there's a couple of different kinds, but most scholars agree that you have to at least pretend to ask Congress to give the president the power to bind the United States as against other countries. And if you're not even going to consult Congress, they call that a sole executive agreement, like just a outright, then the president is usurping the power of Congress. That's a separation of powers issue.
Well, someone once observed that the nice thing about our Constitution is it presents no obstacle to our current form of government.
Right.
Sir, yes.
Yes, as a follow-up, would it be possible, with your connections in Washington, to give us a recent update exactly where is the United Kingdom agreement? Because if we're making a submission to finance in Ottawa, I would like to satisfy them that UK is not on side. Because I think it'll influence them if there is a firm agreement involving the United Kingdom.
Well, in terms of anything in the future that has to be done, as Professor Christians pointed out, Congress is being left completely out of the loop on the IGA with the UK and with all the other IGAs. The only thing that would be necessary on the US side is that Treasury would have to promulgate regulations on domestic American institutions to provide the non-reciprocal, reciprocal information to the partner country under Article 2B of the IGA. Now, Treasury's position is they already have all the legal authority they need to issue those regulations. We haven't seen those regulations, but that's their position, so presumably at some point they'll kick those out, but that would be a unilateral action on the part of Treasury. On the British side, it's much more complicated because they actually would have to get Parliament to pass, as I say, FATCA-oid legislation, British legislation, to force their institutions to supply the information to their revenue service for transmission then to the IRS. So there's lots of things the British would have to do.
Yes, well, now that would be very helpful if you could, in some kind of authoritative way, give us information as to how it's complicated in the United Kingdom, and they should not assume that they have anything close to a signed agreement.
Well, I agree, but I have to say this is one of the differences between our system, of course, which is not a parliamentary system, and a parliamentary system. It is assumed in a parliamentary system that if the government commits to something, they've got the votes to pass it through Parliament. That's really, it's a done deal. On the American side, you can never be sure. If you have to get congressional action for anything the executive agrees to, which is why they're avoiding Congress on implementing this thing. And by the way, it's also one reason why people misunderstand the American side. You hear over and over again foreigners saying, well, now the Treasury has issued these regs, it's pretty clear FATCA will not be repealed. What's that got to do with anything? We don't have a parliamentary system. What the Treasury Department does in issuing regs has, the idea that it's government policy or the Americans have decided to do something, it's a ridiculous notion in our system. But unfortunately, I think in the British system, it's not ridiculous. If the British Treasury Service or whatever their department is has signed something with the Americans, they're confident they can get it through Parliament. It's just a question of time.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. It's not good news, right? So they signed on September 12th, 2012, and then they had this sort of explanatory note, which is a shameful document, yes, right, a 2-page nonsense. And worse, this is the really bad news, the UK is what people are calling son of FATCA. The UK is considering legislation that would mimic the US legislation.
And it would apply initially on the crown dependencies.
Exactly.
Now I saw recently the Isle of Man said they will accept it, but Jersey and Guernsey say they won't unless the Brits make it global like FATCA, which I really don't understand at all. But
I don't know what they're talking about. But so they're talking about an omnibus bill. They're saying they'll put that all together, the FATCA, the IGA, the implementing legislation, and the son of FATCA, that will all come together somehow, some way. So it's not done. It's not done.
It's not. Yeah. Hey, maybe they'll do us a favor and screw it up.
Yes,
that'd be great.
Right.
Anyway, my point is anything you can give us to neutralize the impression that the UK has already signed or is going to sign will help.
Well, let me ask a question in that regard. I mean, how done a deal do you think it is up here? Do you think that they've all but initialed this thing and they're just going through the motions on public comments? Because they're obviously ignoring any objections.
This is just a thought on my part. I think that it is incredibly dangerous to take that position. You are planting in your minds, or we are planting in our minds, the seed of a total capitulation. I believe that what needs to happen and come out of this is, first of all, I once heard it said, some people make things happen, some people watch things happen, and some people ask what happened. Most people, including the media, including the mainstream parties, are absolutely, without a doubt, in the camp of what happened. People who are aware of this, who are not here today, are in the what happened. In this room, because of our interest, our commitment, and our awareness, we are members of a small group of people who are in a position, to the extent that this can be influenced, to influence. And the absolute worst thing, given that we are the only people in this position to do this, is to psychologically make the decision that this is a done deal. It is not a done deal. It is simply not a done deal. The conservative government has been around now for 7 years. It's a long time for any government. It's very difficult for any government to stay in power beyond that. And what we do know about them is they're, like most political parties, is that first and foremost, they want to remain the government. This is an issue that, if understood, if marketed, and if everybody goes out and tells 10 people and get them to tell 10 more people, and if the government is required to justify this, it may make a difference. Now, I want to go back to 2003 in Canada. You may recall that what was happening was that the U.S. was, in front of the United Nations making noises about attacking Iraq. You'll recall that Prime Minister Chrétien in the House of Commons one day said, Canada's not going to go along with the Iraq thing. You may recall the tremendous effect that that had on the U.S. psyche. It was absolutely unbelievable. At the time, the U.S. ambassador to Canada was on the phone, et cetera, et cetera. I believe that Mr. Jatras is absolutely correct, that Canada is the single most important country, the single most important peg, and if we can call sort of the fact a whole. And I agree with you 100%, that if Canada says no, that a large number of other countries are also going to say no. The U.S. is attempting, in the same way they did in the invasion of Iraq in 2003, you may recall the language, the coalition of the willing. They are trying to create a coalition of the willing right now, and interestingly, the UK is the very first on board again. They're nothing but just, they're just nothing but the #1 member of the coalition of the willing, all right? And these other countries are, I actually don't think they've made much progress at all. I think they're making one hell of a lot of noise. But when I look at what's going on in terms of anything that any reasonable person could construe as a signed IGA, it just ain't there. And the worst thing, given the position that Canada has both geographically, historically, in relation to the United States, is to jump in on this. It seems to me that there's only one answer to this IGA, and it is no, and I wouldn't even add the thanks.
That's absolutely correct. And the question is, how do you recreate that 2003 moment? Who can stand up in a place where people have to pay attention to it and say what you just said in the same way that it occurred in 2003? I mean, unfortunately, the Progressive Canadian Party doesn't have a seat in Parliament. And the ones who do have seats in Parliament are watching, not even watching. They're prepared to say what happened after it happened. How do you force the issue? That's the question. How do you get it out in the public domain?
I was going to ask, dovetailing with what John just said. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, take the mic.
The latest audience member is from the Green Party. And it just so happens that Elizabeth is a personal friend of mine.
Well, that is wonderful, and
Even better.
I wonder if we could just ask the member of the Green Party just to introduce himself, and thank you so much for coming. I know Elizabeth was in touch with me by email. Please go ahead.
Yeah, sorry I couldn't come. I had to come down from Barrie, and I just found out about the conference a couple of days ago, so I was able to rearrange enough to be here for part of it anyway. And so I'd like to bring greetings on behalf of the Green Party of Canada. My name is Eric Jacoby-Hawkins, and I am the critic for national revenue and ecological fiscal reform on our shadow cabinet. And I've been in communication with Elizabeth yesterday and today about this, and she is very concerned about this for all of the reasons that have been brought up. We'd like to gather as much information as we can. Now, unfortunately, the House isn't sitting. Now they've gone on their holiday break. They went a couple of days early for one thing. They skipped out on Wednesday instead of the planned Friday, and I'm not sure of the date that they're due to come back. And I don't know if something may be signed in the meantime, but certainly if we had a petition with at least 25 signatures on it, she can present that in the House, and the government is required to respond in some way to a petition. But if we can have one, you know, by the time the House is sitting again, we can certainly present that through her, and the government is required to respond in some way to any petition that's brought forward. No, that can't happen until the House is sitting again. And if there are any other information we can bring forward at that time, I think she would be able to have an opportunity to do that, and we'll look forward to that. As far as our stance on this, I mean, on the one hand, of course, measures that are bona fide ways to try and reduce tax evasion through offshore tax havens and stuff have a place, but they need to be done through the right procedures, through bilateral agreements, not through unilateral with these bizarre sanctions. But we believe that our current course of action should essentially be to advise Canadian banks to ignore FATCA completely and see what happens. And if the U.S. does try to impose these sanctions, they should easily fail under any challenge at the WTO or even NAFTA Chapter 11, because it seems to me that this is exactly the kind of investor state provision that normally we have a big problem with being in NAFTA because it gets used against us. But if the American government is making laws that penalize the profits of Canadian banks, the banks themselves should be able to make a claim for penalties and overturn the law. So, and this is an odd case where that might actually work in our favor. But certainly there is no need to preemptively agree to follow these guidelines, especially where they violate the privacy laws of our own country and our own constitutional rights. And people who are resident in Canada are protected fully by those rights and should continue to be fully protected. So I'd like to gather whatever information we can from this session, and I'll convey it back to her office and work on it from that end.
Do you think she might be amenable to any other action that would help throw the dead cat on the table before Parliament comes back into session, for example, like a newspaper commentary or something like that? Because I think it's so important that an opposition voice that will be heard can ask the hard questions in public of the government. That might have the effect of forestalling a signature during that interim period.
Absolutely. I think that would be an excellent way, and I know she is able to get op-eds into several of the national papers. So. I heard her this morning on CBC. She did a wonderful job, with the whole issue around the China deal in Malaysia. And that's a good time, by the way. Yeah, and let me check my schedule. She has one or two more end-of-year interviews scheduled with, I think, CBC Radio, was that today? Radio, and then she has one on CBC Television on Tuesday and CTV on Sunday. And those are both sort of end-of-year wrap-ups. So if we had a good, strong paragraph, because unfortunately, TV especially is soundbite politics. The radio actually you can get a little more information through, but TV. But if we had basically a paragraph with the strongest points.
And I think if that were tied to specifically that the government should not go ahead and decide something until Parliament comes back in and there's a chance to examine this issue. Because, to tell the truth, I don't think Flaherty and those guys, I don't think they're wild about this either. I think they're doing it because CBA and other institutions are pushing them, saying we have to do it, we have to do it. If they thought they were going to pay for it politically, that the opposition was going to make some hay out of this, I think it might cause them to take a step back, which is all we need from them right now.
So absolutely, if we can put together, a good solid primer, and make sure we find, like some of the things, it seems like we're not quite sure exactly what's specified, what might be signed. So the more we can find out about that, the better.
That we do know.
Okay, excellent.
The nice thing about dealing with diktat from a foreign state is the foreign state just dictates what you have to sign. It makes it convenient for everybody. The IGA text is not negotiable. The only thing that's negotiable is the Annex 2, which lists the types of institutions that will be deemed compliant and don't have to do the FATCOID thing in the partner country. But the IGA itself is not subject to revision. Like I said, it's easy for everybody.
All right, well, I'll make sure I get a copy of that text from you, and we'll work from that.
I wanted to make sure that I had the pronunciation of your first name correctly. It's Eric? Great. The spelling is a little different, so I wasn't quite sure. But thank you, Eric, very much. And I would like to say this, John, if we've got a number of lawyers in the room here, if somebody could handcraft a petition that we would sign and hand to Eric before he goes, that would be a step in the right direction. So would you be willing to do that, John, and get help?
Absolutely. I think that's a great idea. So let's actually, do we have further questions for Mr. Jatras, or where are we on the day? Okay.
We're done with this guy.
Okay, that was a fabulous presentation, for which we all thank you. What I think we need to do here for a second is, or actually maybe we'll take a 10-minute break here. Somebody who feels, actually, I'm wondering if perhaps, Mr. Stevens, you might be the right person to lead the petition in terms of the text. Okay, yeah. So why don't we, I think both in terms of your background and your position, so why don't we actually take a break here for the purpose of getting that petition organized, and I invite you to hold court in whatever, either outside or whatever part of the room you like to work on that, presumably with the assistance of Allison as well. So let's take we'll take 15 minutes then, and perhaps at the end of the 15 minutes, the part of the goal of the break would be to actually read the petition. At the end of the 15 minutes, get it signed and off to the place that it needs to be, and after that we have, who could have known, more content, more great speakers. Thank you.